The first thing I noticed was her perfume, something soft, warm, like honey and old books, and it made the station around me blur, as if the world had dimmed except for her. She was standing by the ticket barrier, one hand loosely holding a leather bag, the other brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Even from across the platform, I could see the way her posture carried both confidence and a quiet caution, like she had learned to carry herself through life's edges without letting them bruise her too visibly. I hesitated, unsure why my feet had carried me here, standing so close to someone I wasn't supposed to notice this way. My eyes traced the curve of her jaw, the faint crease at the corner of her smile, the subtle tremor of her fingers as she adjusted her coat. She caught me looking, and instead of embarrassment, there was this something, a pause in her own rhythm, a recognition that made my stomach tighten. "Are you cold?" she asked, her voice low, brushing against me more than the words themselves. It wasn't a question, really, it was a nudge, an invitation. "I'm fine," I said, though I could feel the chill along my arms, the sudden awareness of her proximity. My hand brushed hers as I shifted slightly to step closer, and the contact was brief but electric, a spark that neither of us acknowledged out loud. She laughed softly, a sound that settled somewhere behind my sternum, not quite a melody, more like a pulse that made the world slower, denser. "You're staring," she said, tilting her head, but there was no accusation there, just a teasing softness that made me want to lean in closer, want to hear her say more, though I didn't even know what more could be. I swallowed. I was just. Words failed me. Every sentence fractured, every thought too loud in my head, and yet I didn't look away. I couldn't. There was gravity here, something that pulled and refused to explain itself. Her eyes flicked to the tracks, then back to me, the faintest shadow passing over her face. The station's hum of engines and footsteps felt distant, as if we existed in a private space carved from light and shadow. I noticed the warmth of her coat near my arm, the subtle scent of her hair, the way her glance lingered a beat too long before drifting away. "Your train's not here yet," she said finally, almost offhand, but her tone carried a weight that set my pulse on edge. She took a small step closer, and I felt the press of her presence like a low, insistent rhythm against mine. My chest tightened, my hands itched to reach, to touch, to feel some assurance that she was real and not just a vision made of quiet longing. The station clock ticked over, loud in the sudden silence that had fallen between us. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words dissolved as soon as I tried to shape them. Instead, I just watched, memorizing the way her lips curved when she noticed a thought passing through her, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her bag strap, the almost imperceptible quiver of her shoulder when a gust of wind lifted strands of her hair. And then she turned, just slightly, her gaze shifting to someone behind me, and the tension in her body faltered for a fraction of a second, a crack, a hint. I followed her eyes, and my stomach dropped. A man was approaching, hurried steps, and the air seemed to thicken with unspoken questions. Her eyes met mine again, sharper now, and a whisper of a smile tugged at her lips, not quite secret, not quite invitation. Then she said something I didn't expect, and the words trembled in the space between us. "Come with me, instead of him." The train rumbled into the station, its brakes screeching, the smell of hot metal and rain-soaked tracks filling the air. I followed her, hesitant, half afraid that someone, anyone, would notice the unusual closeness between us. She moved with the kind of grace I had always admired from afar, a rhythm that made my own steps feel clumsy, too aware of the space between us. She glanced at me, that faint, fleeting look that seemed to weigh more than words. I could feel it, the tension of her presence, a line drawn and redrawn in the silence. I had known women before, had dated, had stumbled through short-lived flings that never lingered, but she was different. Older, yes, but also untouchable in ways I couldn't name. Something in her eyes held a history, a caution, as if every relationship she'd ever had left a mark on her that I wasn't allowed to see. I remembered snippets she'd let slip, hints of a life she guarded fiercely. Divorced, lonely in the quiet hours when her house smelled of brewed tea and old wood. A husband who had left too soon, a love that had ended in shameful silence. She carried those losses in her shoulders, the way she sometimes hugged herself when she thought no one was watching, and the way her laugh sometimes faltered mid-phrase, as if she had forgotten it entirely. And yet there was this pull, a gravity that defied the caution I should have felt. Our age gap wasn't just a number, it was a barrier made of judgment, of whispered warnings from the world. People would notice. I would be noticed. And yet, I could not look away, could not stop the surge in my chest when she leaned near, when her hand brushed mine with no purpose beyond proximity. We moved to a quieter part of the platform, away from the noise of commuters and announcements. She stopped, and I realized I had been holding my breath. She turned to face me, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her coat. Her eyes lingered on mine for a long moment, and I felt the impulse to reach out, to bridge the distance she always left just at the edge of my reach. "You always notice things," she said softly, almost a whisper, brushing a finger against the strap of her bag. The movement was casual, but it sent a jolt through me. "Even when I don't want to be noticed." I guess I do," I admitted, my voice uneven. "I notice you." The words sounded too simple, too dangerous, yet I couldn't take them back. A shiver ran through her, and for a moment, her eyes dropped, a subtle falter in her composure. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that was both a tease and a warning. She leaned just slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine, a ghost of a contact that made my stomach knot. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat went dry, and I swallowed instead. I noticed how she smelled, faintly of jasmine, and something older, like parchment and sunlight. I noticed the curve of her wrist when she tucked her hair behind her ear again. I noticed her hesitation, the pull of restraint in her movements, and I wanted to step over every line she drew, every boundary she so carefully maintained. "I shouldn't," she murmured, almost to herself. And yet she didn't step back. She didn't move away. Her hand brushed mine again, longer this time, as if testing the weight of the moment. My heart pounded, my fingers tightening just slightly, afraid she might disappear before I could say, or do, anything. We stood there, suspended in the clamor of the station and the quiet of our unspoken understanding. Neither of us moved, either of us spoke, and yet the electricity hummed, undeniable, heavy in the space between us. I wanted to reach for her, to close the gap, but I waited, caught between longing and respect, fear and desire. Then, with a slight shift of her weight, her fingers lingered against my hand just long enough to anchor me in the present. The world around us receded, and for a moment, there was only the warmth of her, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, and the unspoken promise vibrating in the air, that neither of us would be able to forget this. The platform was quieter now, a lull between trains, but my pulse felt deafening. She was there, just a step away, the faint warmth of her coat brushing my arm, her presence like sunlight pressing against my skin. I tried to look at the tracks, tried to focus on the empty rails ahead, but every glance at her brought my attention spiraling back. "Did you miss your stop before?" I asked, my voice barely more than a breath. She shook her head, eyes narrowing, a flicker of something unspoken passing over her face. Her lips parted slightly, and I imagined tracing their curve with my thumb, imagining the warmth of her breath against mine. My hand twitched, wanting to reach, to find hers again. She leaned ever so slightly closer, and the space between us shrank to an almost unbearable fraction. A ping, my phone vibrating in my pocket, startled me, and she flinched as if she had expected it. I pulled it out, half dreading the interruption, half relieved. A message from a friend asking if I was okay. I typed a quick reply, my fingers brushing against hers accidentally. The contact lasted just a second, and yet it was enough to make my chest hammer. "You've been distracted," she murmured, her voice low, teasing, almost a warning. She tilted her head, and I could feel the heat radiating from her face. I tried to respond, tried to ground myself in words, but they caught somewhere in my throat. We stood there, the silence stretching, punctuated by distant footsteps, the faint whistle of a train in the distance. My eyes traced the line of her jaw again, the way her collarbone peeked from beneath the coat, the subtle curve of her neck as she turned toward me. Each detail was a map I didn't want to memorize but couldn't help following. I shouldn't be here," she said suddenly, the words almost swallowed in a rush of breath. She stepped closer, just a hair's width closer, and I felt the magnetic pull, the irresistible tension pressing against every rational thought. My fingers itched to brush her cheek, to hold her hand, but we both knew the line we weren't supposed to cross. Another vibration, a call this time, made me step back slightly, breaking the moment. I glanced at the screen, knowing it would shatter this fragile, suspended bubble. I ignored it. She noticed, and the corner of her mouth twitched into something that looked suspiciously like approval. "Dangerous," I whispered, almost to myself. She didn't laugh, didn't contradict me. She simply leaned in, just enough that our shoulders touched fully, our breaths mingling in a quiet, forbidden rhythm. My heart slammed in my chest, every nerve alight with longing, fear, and something dangerous that we couldn't name. Her hand brushed my arm again, lingering, and I felt the pull to tilt my head, to close the fraction of space that remained. Our eyes met, charged with questions we wouldn't speak aloud. The world felt like it had narrowed to the two of us, a tiny orbit of stolen moments, of near confessions and trembling restraint. And then the platform echoed with approaching footsteps. I stiffened. She froze beside me, our bodies still pressed together, our faces impossibly close. For a heartbeat, it felt like the universe had stopped, holding its breath, letting us hover on the edge of something irrevocable. Her fingers tightened slightly against my arm, a tiny anchor, a silent acknowledgement of the pull between us. I wanted to reach for her face, to lean in, to close that gap, but the sound of an arriving commuter made us both flinch and step apart. Yet even as we pulled back, our hands lingered, the faintest brush of skin against skin, and the electricity didn't diminish. In fact, it grew, coiling tighter around us, a promise that whatever restraint we tried to impose, whatever social rules whispered in our ears, nothing could fully separate us. And in that charged, trembling silence, we were closer than ever. The cafe was almost empty, the late afternoon sun slanting across the tables in golden streaks. I watched her stir her tea, the spoons circling absent-mindedly, and something in me snapped. All the careful restraint, the polite distance, the unspoken rules, it evaporated in an instant, leaving a raw, thudding ache I couldn't ignore. "You're impossible," I said, my voice rougher than I intended, startling even myself. She looked up, eyes wide, and for a heartbeat I thought she might laugh or scold me. Instead, she just stared, lips parted, as if she had been waiting for me to say it all along. "Impossible?" she repeated, voice soft but sharp, carrying both curiosity and warning. "Yes," I admitted, stepping closer despite every warning ringing in my head. "You make it impossible for me to think straight. Impossible to leave. Impossible to pretend I'm normal around you." Her breath caught, I could see it in the slight hitch of her chest, the way her fingers trembled as they grazed the rim of her cup. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with tension. I wanted to touch her, to brush that loose strand of hair from her face, to feel the warmth of her shoulder pressed against mine. And I did. My hand moved before I had a chance to think, soft against her temple, sliding the hair behind her ear. Her eyes fluttered closed, and my thumb brushed against the skin there, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the faint pulse at her temple. "You," she began, then stopped, her words swallowed by the charge in the room. I leaned closer, my voice a low whisper near her ear, and I could feel the shiver that ran through her. "Why do you do this to me?" I murmured. "Why do you make me want things I shouldn't?" Her body shifted subtly, leaning into me, her arm brushing mine, a hesitant invitation I didn't resist. Her warmth pressed against me, and I was dizzy with it, desire tangled with fear, guilt mixing with an ache that had been building for weeks. She faltered, eyes meeting mine, searching, trembling. "I can't. I shouldn't, I know," I whispered, catching her wrist gently, holding it just enough to anchor her in the moment. "I know. And yet, here we are." Her lips parted slightly, a breathless, fragile pause that made my chest constrict. My hand brushed along her arm, then up to her shoulder, the tiniest pressure, just enough to feel her hesitate and lean ever so slightly closer. My lips itched to close the remaining distance. Her gaze dropped for a second, then back up at me, and I swear the world narrowed to the space between us. The hum of the cafe, the scrape of chairs, the distant chatter, all faded. Only the rhythm of our breathing, the unspoken confession hanging between us, the magnetic pull neither of us could deny. "Don't," she whispered, trembling, but she didn't step away. She didn't pull back. Her body leaned just enough to let me feel her warmth, the soft press of her cheek against the side of my face. My hands hovered at her waist, tempted to draw her closer, to finally bridge the last, impossible inch. The moment stretched, fragile as glass, electric as lightning. One more move, one more breath, and the boundary between restraint and surrender would vanish. And then, a loud crash from the street outside made her start, her hand jerking slightly from mine, eyes wide and alert. The spell broke. My chest heaved, but even as we pulled back, the weight of the tension lingered. Her gaze met mine again, slow and steady, and in it I read the same thing I was feeling: anticipation, fear, longing, and the desperate promise of what was about to happen. I leaned just a fraction closer, our lips almost brushing, and whispered, almost inaudibly, "I can't stop thinking about you." The world hung suspended. One heartbeat away, 1 second from collapse. I thought the cafe had been our secret world, a bubble we could retreat into, where desire and restraint danced on the edge of every glance. But that illusion shattered the moment she leaned closer to whisper something I didn't expect. I saw him," she murmured, voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of the air conditioner. Her hand trembled slightly as it brushed against mine on the table. "Who?" I asked, heart skipping. "My son," she said, and the words landed like stones. My chest tightened, my mind reeling with implications I hadn't wanted to consider. The thought of him, someone who knew her intimately, someone whose judgment might matter more than mine, changed the air between us. I could feel her tension, the way her shoulders stiffened, the subtle hitch in her breath, the way she kept her gaze half averted. Yet, even as fear flickered across her features, there was a softness in the way her hand lingered against mine, as if reaching for reassurance, for permission to exist in this dangerous moment. I leaned back slightly, instinctively, both from shock and from the sudden, sharp awareness of how taboo this had become. My hand twitched, hovering near hers, drawn despite the caution screaming in my mind. She noticed, of course, and her lips pressed together briefly, a faint quiver betraying her own struggle. I didn't tell him anything," she added quickly, almost desperately, eyes locked on mine now. "But I wanted to. I wanted to tell someone, anyone who could understand." Her voice cracked ever so slightly, and I realized then just how fragile she felt under the weight of her own secret. I reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, letting my thumb trace the edge of her jaw. Her eyes fluttered closed at the touch, and a tremor ran through her shoulders. The air between us thickened, the line between comfort and something far more dangerous collapsing. "You shouldn't be telling me this," I whispered, low enough that only she could hear. My hands remained near her, hesitant but unable to retreat. It changes everything." Her gaze snapped to mine, sharp, raw. "I know," she admitted, her breath catching. "And yet, it doesn't." Her words struck me harder than any confession could. She leaned toward me, closer than she had before, the faint warmth of her coat against my chest, her arm brushing mine in the most accidental, deliberate way imaginable. My fingers ached to curl around hers, to pull her into the orbit we both knew we were orbiting. The sound of laughter from another table startled us both, and we stepped slightly apart, yet even then, our bodies remained close, almost touching, almost aware. The tension between us had transformed, shifting from a slow burn to something urgent, perilous, undeniable. "I don't know if this is right," I said, voice low, the words trembling despite my attempt at steadiness. "Right?" she repeated, a whisper, her lips almost grazing my ear as she leaned just slightly closer. What's right has nothing to do with us. A shiver passed over me, and I felt her shiver too, mirrored through the light brush of her hand against mine. Desire, fear, guilt, and thrill collided in a storm too intense to ignore. I swallowed hard. Then, what do we do? Her eyes met mine, steady and bright, and in that glance I saw the same longing, the same surrender, the same willingness to step over the edge. She reached out, fingers trembling slightly, brushing my palm. The contact was electric, delicate, and infinitely consequential. I want this, she admitted finally, voice barely audible. Her other hand rested near my arm, poised between closeness and restraint. And then, without another word, she leaned closer, so that the warmth of her body pressed against mine just enough to make the world tilt on its axis. The moment hung, suspended, one heartbeat from collapse. It was impossible, terrifying and inevitable. The rain had started outside, tapping against the windowpane in staccato rhythms that matched my heartbeat. We stood there, in the small apartment she had insisted I wait in, the air thick with the scent of her tea, her perfume, the electricity that hung between us like a live wire. I could feel her closer than ever, her warmth pressing through the thin space between us, a whisper away from everything I'd been longing for. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching, carrying the weight of months of restraint, longing, and unsaid words. My hands twitched at my sides, wanting to close the distance, wanting to bridge the last inch, but my mind shouted caution, the world outside, judgment, consequences. And yet, desire doesn't negotiate. I shouldn't, she whispered, voice trembling, lips just above mine, her breath mingling with mine. I shouldn't do this. I know, I said, equally low, letting my thumb brush against the side of her hand. And I can't stop wanting it either. She exhaled sharply, leaning ever so slightly into me, a fraction closer, just enough that I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. I wanted to speak, to convince her with words, but words felt hollow. Instead, I let my hand rise slowly, brushing the hair from her face, lingering near her cheek, feeling the warmth, the subtle tremor of her pulse beneath my fingers. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes closing for a heartbeat as she let the moment stretch, fragile and infinite. The world beyond the window ceased to exist, the storm outside, the rules, the people who would never understand, all of it reduced to this one suspended instant. I don't want to step back anymore, she said, barely audible, the words carrying everything she hadn't said in months. My chest tightened, a mix of relief, fear, and the kind of longing that had been building since the station months ago. I tilted my head slightly, our foreheads almost touching, the smallest space remaining between our mouths. Her hand lifted to rest against my shoulder, trembling slightly, grounding us both. Then we don't, I whispered. My voice was rough, raw, and unpolished, and yet it carried a certainty that surprised even me. We moved closer, slowly, cautiously, like the world itself demanded respect for what we were about to do. I could feel her inhale sharply, the brush of her arms against mine, the subtle shiver running through her as our bodies aligned. Every inch of contact sent sparks through me, igniting every nerve with the awareness of her presence. We didn't speak after that. There was no need. Every breath, every brush of skin, every quiet pulse of energy between us said more than words ever could. I rested my forehead against hers, fingertips tracing invisible paths along her arms, memorizing her, anchoring this impossible, human, messy closeness in my memory. For the first time, the hesitation, the guilt, the fear, they were all still there, but they didn't matter. Desire had taken the lead, messy and beautiful, and we let it. Her lips hovered near mine, not quite touching, yet the space between us vibrated with the intensity of everything unspoken. My hand cupped her cheek gently, thumb brushing along her jaw, and in that small gesture, we understood each other fully, the longing, the restraint, the risk, the reward. We stepped no closer yet somehow closed the distance entirely, the electric charge between us a quiet affirmation of the choice we had made. Nothing else existed except us, messy and human, tethered by desire and the fragile, intoxicating certainty that we could finally face it, together. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle by the time we stepped onto the quiet street. Street lights reflected in puddles, shimmering golden paths that seemed to mirror the warmth spreading through me. We walked side by side, shoulders brushing, hands hovering near one another, either daring to let go. She glanced at me, and I saw the familiar spark, a mixture of amusement, relief, and something softer, something more fragile that only I seemed to notice. I smiled back, and that small, private exchange made the world feel less complicated, less risky. "Do you ever regret this?" I asked quietly, glancing down at her hand, so close to mine. Her lips twitched into a faint smile, and she shook her head. "Not for a second," she said. The simplicity of it struck me. Years of hesitation, fear, and unspoken longing distilled into that one honest sentence. We paused at the corner, the faint scent of wet asphalt and jasmine mingling. I reached out and took her hand slowly, deliberately, letting our fingers intertwine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted slightly, leaning into me, and I felt the quiet weight of her trust, her surrender. For a moment, we just stood there, bodies close, hands linked, hearts beating in a rhythm that felt intimate and unshakable. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, and she leaned her forehead against mine, eyes closing, letting the world slip away. Her breath mingled with mine, warm and steady, and I realized that every ounce of restraint we had clung to was no longer necessary. "I think I'm going to like this," I murmured, voice low and rough, letting my thumb trace the back of her hand. Her laugh was soft, a trembling sound that warmed the spaces inside me I hadn't known were empty. "You're going to like a lot more than that," she whispered back, her lips barely brushing my temple. We moved slowly, instinctively, until we were side by side on the bench near the corner, huddled against the chill and the last remnants of rain. Our hands remained intertwined, our bodies close but unhurried, as if every second counted and yet none of it needed to be rushed. I rested my head near hers, letting the faint curve of her hair brush my cheek. The age gap, the fears, the whispers of the world outside, they all dissolved in that moment. What remained was warmth, quiet understanding, and the raw, human truth of being near someone who finally felt like home. She tilted her head, pressing her lips briefly to my forehead, and I felt it in my chest, a simple gesture, but it carried all the weight of months of longing, hesitation, and finally, surrender. I held her a little tighter, fingers interlaced with hers, and for the first time, it felt as if the world outside could wait. We stayed like that for a long while, simply being together, letting the rain's rhythm outside echo our own newfound closeness. No words were necessary. Every glance, every breath, every touch spoke volumes. And in the quiet warmth between us, I finally understood, it wasn't just desire. It was connection, trust, and the messy, unpolished intimacy of two people choosing each other, despite everything the world might say. Her hand squeezed mine gently, and I smiled, heart full, knowing we had crossed the line into something irreversible, something honest, sensual, and beautifully human. We sat there a little longer, letting the city fade, letting the storm pass, knowing that whatever came next, we were together.